came up with this famous, the famous logo, "I love New York." That's when this was devised. And there was at the same time as they were cutting all of the services amongst the unions, there was this wonderful moment in this story when there was this incredible kind of conflict. The fire union and the police union didn't like the fact that they were, being laid off and all these kinds of things. And so they launched a campaign to go against the investment bankers' campaign to market the city, and they started to proclaim something called Fear City. And they went out to Kennedy Airport and all these other places and gave people leaflets and said things like this: there are no police to protect you in Manhattan, so don't travel on the buses except at midday. Don't go on the subway ever. And by the way, if your hotel burns down, you just better jump out the window because there'll be no fire services to rescue you. And they actually actually this got back to Europe and all the rest of it, and the tourist stuff started to drop off. And so the investment bankers said to the city, "Hey, we've got to do something about this." So they started to rehire fire services and they started to rehire police. But guess where they put them? They put them all in Manhattan. They took them away from the boroughs, they took them away from Staten Island and all this kind of stuff. So you ended up with a massive crime wave out in the boroughs and all this kind of stuff, while as you tried to seal off Manhattan as the playground for the rich and the place where the cultural services were going to be and the cultural activities were going to be. Now, what the New York City thing did, and Bill Tabb at the time wrote a little book where he kind of said, the Reagan administration, when it came in after this, simply transformed what had been done to New York and said, this is going to be our national policy. And it went even further than that, because if you look at what the IMF got up to after 1980 or so, this became then part of the whole kind of apparatus of structural adjustment. In other words, what was pioneered in New York City in 1975 was structural adjustment. And that structural adjustment then became part of a global strategy. But the pragmatic aspects of this were twofold. What the New York City disciplinary thing did was it departed from neoliberal theory in just a couple of ways. The first way was that in the event of a conflict between the integrity of financial institutions and the well-being of a population, you choose the integrity of financial institutions. This is what the Emergency Financial Control Board did. It brought in all the money and all the taxes, it paid off the bondholders, and whatever's left went into the city budget, which is what they did. And what this said is that actually you move from a society where in neoliberal theory, lender should beware. If you make bad investments, you should bear the cost of it. But what neoliberal practice did was to say, hey, it's borrower beware. And after that, what happened to Mexico? Mexico went bankrupt in 1982, and instead of all the New York banks going bankrupt, which they should have done because of the way they had used those petrodollars in Mexico, no, we're going to make the Mexicans pay. And that's, of course, what structural adjustment is about all the time. It's about making the people pay for financial institutional mistakes. And what we've seen is a long, long history of the last 30 years of precisely that thing happening. How many bailouts have you seen? The savings and loan stuff, the long-term capital management, you bail them out. You don't put them all in jail and say, hey, you made the big mistakes, you're the one. The people have to pay. And that's the sort of principle which has worked out in New York City. And that's not a neoliberal principle. That is very much against neoliberal theory. The second principle is this, that the state under neoliberal theory shouldn't be actively intervening in the economy. But what the state did after 1975 in New York City was to start to invest in the infrastructures which were going to support financial services, tourism, and all the rest of it. So actually what they did was they started to put this together in a certain way of using state monies. Instead of using them for the support of people and public hospitals, they started to put them into the infrastructures needed for all of these services. And this was called creating a good business climate. And what this means is, quite simply, if there's a conflict between creating a good business climate and the well-being of a population, you choose creating a good business climate. And I think it's significant that the last World Bank report that I read, development report I read, is precisely instructing people how to create good business climates around the world. Now, good business climate is what? Good business climate means no regulation, or regulation only on those things you don't like. It means flexible labour markets. It means sort of open access and to political power, all of those kinds of things. So what we start to get is a lot of public-private partnerships which erupt in the 1970s, 1980s as part of the solution to the situation. So the pragmatic version of neoliberalism is very much about that. And what we've seen again and again is those two principles visited upon different countries. And if you look at something like the Southeast Asian crisis, which I briefly describe in there, or what happened to South Korea, or what happened to Argentina, we'll see this principle working again and again and again. So the question here is, what is that principle doing, and why that departure from neoliberal theory into that neoliberal practice? While the rhetoric of neoliberal theory there about freedom of the market and freedom of this and all this kind of stuff and freedom of choice and da-da-da-da is all there. And nevertheless, these practices are at the heart of what neoliberalization has been about, and how and why did that come about in the particular way it did. This leads to the third thesis that I explore, which actually turns out to be the only one that really makes sense. And that is that this whole kind of thing that went on in the 1970s was a class project, that it was about the restoration of class power. Because if you start to look very carefully at the data in the 1970s, there was a wealth crash. Just thinking about this country, there was a wealth crash in the 1970s. The rich were really hurting. And they were not only hurting there, they were hurting in incomes. In the 1970s, the top 1% of income earners in this country received only about 7 or 8% of the national income. By the time you get to the year 2000, they're receiving 16% of the national income. And right now, my guess is it's getting closer and closer to 20%. But even so they have doubled or more their share of the national income. When you look at the 0.1%, they have tripled their share of the national income. And actually, the same story is told in Britain when you go look at the data in Britain. And then an interesting thing occurs when you start going around and say, when did neoliberalization come to Mexico? Big time. Well, it came in 1990, 92, 93. By 1997, you find 14 Mexicans on the Forbes wealthiest billionaires club list. What happened in the ex-Soviet Union and Russia after shock therapy? 7 oligarchs take over about 50% of the economy. You just go around everywhere you look, and you find as soon as a wave of neoliberalization strikes, then the income distribution shifts dramatically. Not simply the top 10%, not simply to the top 1%, but the top 0.1%. And then you start to look at other data. For instance, in the New York Times just recently, you can trust the New York Times sometimes on something, is they had a thing on how wealthy are the Forbes wealthiest Americans these days. And the average wealth on sort of standardized money form in 1985 was something like 600 million. Now it's 2.8 billion. In other words, they have quadrupled the wealth. And everywhere you look, you'll find exactly the same kind of data popping up at you. And even last year, there was another item in the New York Times just recently which talked about the tax returns. And the only group that's actually increased its income above the rate of inflation is the top 1% of income earners in the country between 2003 and 2004. And when you go to the 0.1%, they've increased their income by 9%, as opposed to 3.5% for the 1%. So it's actually an incredible concentration of wealth which is occurring, and has occurred globally. And at this point you say to yourself, well, okay, maybe this is just an accident, all right? And actually,